Welcome to the Rainy Night Storyteller. In this quiet space, where the rain whispers like secrets in the dark, I will guide you through chilling tales of mystery and horror. Turn off the lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let the soothing sound of the rain carry you into a world of the unknown. Before we dive into tonight's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the rain falling and the stories coming. Are you ready? Let's begin the tale. Shadow of the Urals. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the flimsy nylon of the tent. Inside, huddled in the feeble warmth of their sleeping bags, figures lay still, their breath misting in the frigid air. Outside, the Ural Mountains loomed, shrouded in an oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow the very stars. Ekaterina shivered, not entirely from the cold. A prickling sensation crawled across her skin, a feeling of being watched. It had been like this for days, a growing unease that settled over them like a shroud as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. She glanced at the others, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light of the lantern. Igor, their leader, lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the tent, his brow furrowed with worry. Alexei, ever the pragmatist, snored softly, oblivious to the tension that hung thick in the air. And Nina, her eyes wide and fearful, clutched a small icon of Saint Sergius, her lips moving in silent prayer. They had been on the trail for 5 days, following the ill-fated path of the Dyatlov Pass expedition, a group of hikers who had met a mysterious and gruesome end in these very mountains decades ago. What had begun as a challenge, a test of their endurance and courage, had slowly morphed into something more sinister. The mountains, with their desolate beauty and unforgiving terrain, seemed to press in on them, whispering secrets in the howling wind. The first sign that something was amiss came 2 days ago. They had discovered a set of footprints, impossibly large, leading away from their campsite. The prints were unlike anything they had ever seen. The stride too long, the impressions too deep. Igor, ever the rational one, had dismissed them as bare tracks, but Ekaterina had seen the doubt in his eyes. Bears didn't walk upright. Then there were the sounds. At night, when the wind died down and the silence became absolute, they would hear it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the mountain. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end, a sound that spoke of something ancient and malevolent. And now, tonight, the feeling of dread had intensified. Ekaterina felt it in the marrow of her bones, a certainty that something was terribly wrong. She reached out and touched Nina's arm, her fingers finding cold, clammy skin. "Nina," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Are you awake?" Nina's eyes fluttered open, and a look of terror flashed across her face. "Ekaterina," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I saw something outside the tent." "What? What did you see?" Nina hesitated, her gaze darting towards the tent flap. It was a shadow, a tall, dark shadow. It was just standing there, watching us. Ekaterina's heart pounded in her chest. She strained to hear any sound beyond the wind, but there was nothing. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Nina nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure. It was there. I saw it." A wave of icy terror washed over Ekaterina. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were not alone in the wilderness. Something was out there, something dark and hungry, and it was watching them. Igor, roused by their hushed whispers, stirred in his sleeping bag. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Nina saw something," Ekaterina said, her voice barely a whisper. Outside, Igor sat up, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. "What do you mean? Something? What did she see?" Before Nina could answer, a sound cut through the howling wind, a sound that sent a jolt of fear through them all. It was a scraping sound, like claws on canvas, coming from the side of the tent. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way in. Nina let out a muffled scream, burying her face in her hands. Alexei, now wide awake, scrambled for his knife, his eyes darting around the tent in panic. Igor, his face grim, grabbed a metal pole from the corner of the tent and moved towards the sound. "Stay back," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. The tension in the tent was almost unbearable, the air thick with fear. Then, with a sickening tearing sound, the canvas of the tent ripped open, revealing a gaping hole. A blast of icy wind and snow swept into the tent, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into darkness. Ekaterina screamed, her voice lost in the howling wind. She could hear the others shouting, their voices panicked and confused. Then, she felt it, a cold, clammy hand, reaching out from the darkness, grasping her arm. She tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong, like iron. She screamed again, her voice raw with terror, as she was dragged towards the gaping hole in the tent. The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the blinding snowstorm was the terrified faces of her friends, their eyes wide with horror, their mouths open in silent screams. Ekaterina awoke with a gasp, her body shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. She was lying in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls and the steady beep of the heart monitor a stark contrast to the nightmare she had just endured. A nurse, her face etched with concern, rushed to her side. "Ekaterina? You're awake. How are you feeling?" Ekaterina blinked, her mind still reeling from the horror of the dream. I had a nightmare," she stammered, her voice hoarse. The nurse smiled reassuringly. "It's all right, dear. You're safe now. You were found unconscious near the Dyatlov Pass. You were suffering from hypothermia and exposure. You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days? Ekaterina's mind raced. The memories of the past few days, the strange footprints, the eerie sounds, the terrifying attack in the tent. Were they real or just a figment of her fevered imagination? "Where are the others?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Igor? Nina? Alexei?" The nurse's smile faltered. "Ekaterina, you were alone when the rescue team found you. There was no one else." Ekaterina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. No one else? But that couldn't be right. They had been together, in the tent, just hours ago. Had they abandoned her? Or had something happened to them? The nurse, sensing her distress, gently placed a hand on her arm. "Ekaterina, you've been through a terrible ordeal. Your mind is playing tricks on you. Just try to rest. You'll be all right." But Ekaterina knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. The nightmare felt too real, too vivid, and the nurse's words, meant to comfort, only served to deepen the chilling fear that gripped her heart. She was alone, stranded in a world of snow and shadows, haunted by a terror she could not explain. And somewhere, out there in the vast wilderness of the Ural Mountains, something dark and malevolent was waiting. The days that followed were a blur of medical tests, bland hospital food, and the well-meaning but ultimately empty reassurances of doctors and nurses. Ekaterina, however, remained trapped in a chilling limbo between the world of the living and the haunting realm of her nightmares. The doctors attributed her visions to the trauma she had endured, the effects of hypothermia and a concussion sustained during her ordeal. But Ekaterina knew better. The terror that clung to her, the unshakable feeling of being watched, was not something that could be explained away by medical science. She spent her days staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape, her mind replaying the events of the expedition with agonizing clarity. The strange footprints, the unsettling sounds, the feeling of being stalked, these were not hallucinations, but fragments of a terrifying reality that no one else seemed to acknowledge. One evening, a young doctor, Dr. Volkov, came to check on her. He was a kind man, with a gentle demeanor and patient eyes. He listened attentively as Ekaterina recounted her experiences, his expression a mixture of concern and professional skepticism. Ekaterina, he said, his voice soft, I understand that what you experienced was terrifying, but you must understand, the human mind is capable of creating incredibly vivid illusions, especially under extreme stress. It's a survival mechanism, a way of coping with trauma. Ekaterina shook her head, her voice trembling. But it wasn't an illusion, Dr. Volkov. I know what I saw. I know what happened. Dr. Volkov sighed. Ekaterina, there's no evidence to support your claims. You were alone when the rescue team found you. There were no signs of anyone else, no footprints, no disturbances. It's as if your companions simply vanished into thin air. But they were there, Ekaterina insisted, her voice rising in desperation. We were attacked. Something took them. Dr. Volkov remained silent for a moment, studying her with a thoughtful expression. Ekaterina, he said finally, I believe that you believe what you're saying, but sometimes the mind can be a very unreliable narrator. Perhaps in time, the memories will fade, and you'll be able to move on. But Ekaterina knew she would never move on. The memories were etched into her soul, a constant reminder of the horror she had witnessed, the friends she had lost. And as the days turned into weeks, a growing sense of determination took root within her. She would not let the mystery of their disappearance remain unsolved. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Upon her release from the hospital, Ekaterina returned to her small apartment in Moscow, a shell of her former self. The vibrant city, once a source of excitement and energy, now felt alien and oppressive. The faces in the crowd seemed indifferent, their lives untouched by the darkness that had consumed her own. She spent her days poring over maps of the Ural Mountains, tracing the route of their expedition, searching for any clue that might explain what had happened. She read accounts of the Dyatlov Pass incident, drawing parallels between the mysterious deaths of those hikers and the disappearance of her friends. She even delved into obscure folklore, seeking legends of creatures and spirits that haunted the mountains, hoping to find some resonance with her own experiences. But the more she searched, the deeper the mystery became. The official explanation for the Dyatlov Pass incident remained inconclusive, a chilling testament to the unknown forces that lurked in the wilderness. And as for her own companions, they had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a void of unanswered questions and a gnawing sense of dread. One evening, while sifting through her belongings from the expedition, Ekaterina stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal. It was Nina's journal, filled with her neat, precise handwriting. Ekaterina's heart pounded as she opened it, hoping to find some clue, some insight into the events that had led to their disappearance. As she turned the pages, a chill ran down her spine. Nina's entries, initially filled with excitement and anticipation for the expedition, gradually grew darker, more ominous. She described a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, of being followed. She wrote of strange dreams, vivid and disturbing, filled with images of shadowy figures and whispering voices. And then, in the final entry, dated the day before their disappearance, Nina wrote of a terrifying encounter. She described seeing a tall, shadowy figure standing outside their tent, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She wrote of a feeling of overwhelming dread, a certainty that something evil was upon them. Ekaterina closed the journal, her hands trembling. Nina's words confirmed her worst fears. They had not been alone in the mountains. Something had been watching them, stalking them, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. A wave of grief washed over her, followed by a surge of anger and determination. She would not let Nina's death be in vain. She would return to the mountains, to the place where her friends had vanished, and she would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The Ural Mountains loomed on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks piercing the gray, unforgiving sky. Ekaterina, bundled in layers of thick winter clothing, stood at the foot of the trail, her breath clouding the air. It had been 6 months since the ill-fated expedition, 6 months of restless nights and haunting memories. Now, She was back, driven by an insatiable need for answers, a desperate hope to find some trace of her lost friends. She had spent the intervening months meticulously planning her return. She had studied maps, consulted with experienced mountaineers, and even sought the advice of local shamans, hoping to glean some insight into the mysteries of the mountains. She knew the risks, the dangers that lurked in the wilderness, but the fear was a distant echo compared to the burning obsession that consumed her. Her backpack was heavy with supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, a compass, and a sturdy ice axe. But her most valuable possession was a small, worn notebook in Nina's journal. She carried it with her like a talisman, its pages filled with Nina's fears and premonitions, a chilling testament to the unseen forces that haunted these mountains. Ekaterina took a deep breath, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs. She adjusted her backpack, gripped her ice axe, and began the ascent. The trail was treacherous, the snow deep and unforgiving. The wind howled through the valleys, carrying with it a sense of isolation and foreboding. But Ekaterina pressed on, her determination fueled by a grief that refused to be silenced. As she climbed, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. The trees thinned, their branches gnarled and twisted, their silhouettes stark against the snow-covered slopes. The only sounds were the crunch of her boots on the frozen ground and the mournful cry of the wind. She reached the site of their last campsite as dusk began to settle. The remnants of their tent, torn and tattered, lay half buried in the snow, a grim reminder of the night of the attack. Ekaterina felt a shiver run down her spine, the memories of that night flooding back with chilling clarity. She set up her own tent a short distance away, her movements methodical and efficient. She built a small fire, the flames providing a welcome warmth against the encroaching cold. As darkness fell, she sat by the fire, her gaze fixed on the shadowy slopes of the mountain, her mind filled with thoughts of her lost friends. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence, a sound that sent a jolt of fear through her. It was a low, guttural growl, the same sound she had heard that night in the tent. It seemed to come from the depths of the mountain, echoing through the valleys, carrying with it a sense of ancient malice. Ekaterina's heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed her ice axe, her knuckles white around the handle. She scanned the darkness, her senses on high alert, but there was nothing to be seen. The growl subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence that was even more unsettling. She knew then that she was not alone. Something was out there, watching her, waiting, the same something that had taken her friends. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that stretched and twisted like phantoms in the darkness. Ekaterina huddled closer to the flames, her ice axe clutched tightly in her hand. The growl had echoed through the mountains, leaving a resonating silence that amplified every rustle of the wind, every creak of the snow beneath her feet. Fear, a primal and icy grip, tightened around her heart, but beneath it burned a defiant ember of determination. She would not be driven away. Not this time. She pulled Nina's journal from her pack, its worn leather cover cold against her fingers. The pages, filled with Nina's increasingly frantic entries, were a stark reminder of the escalating horror that had consumed their expedition. As she read, a chilling detail caught her attention, something she had overlooked before. Nina had written about a recurring dream, a vision of a swirling vortex of light high above the mountains, pulsating with an eerie blue glow. She described a feeling of being drawn towards it, a sense of inevitability and dread. Ekaterina's gaze drifted upwards, towards the inky blackness that shrouded the peaks. Could there be some connection between Nina's visions and the mysterious force that haunted these mountains? Suddenly, a flicker of movement at the edge of the firelight caught her eye. A shadow, tall and slender, detached itself from the darkness and moved towards her with an almost unnatural grace. Ekaterina's breath hitched in her throat. She gripped her ice axe, her heart pounding like a drum. The shadow stopped just beyond the reach of the firelight, its form obscured by the darkness. Who's there? Ekaterina called out, her voice trembling slightly. The shadow remained silent, motionless. Ekaterina felt a wave of panic wash over her. Was this it? Was this the creature that had taken her friends? Then, the shadow spoke, its voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to slither through the air. Ekaterina. The voice sent a shiver down her spine. It was a voice she knew, a voice that haunted her dreams. It was Nina's voice. Nina? Ekaterina whispered, her voice barely audible. Is that you? The shadow stepped forward, into the flickering firelight. It was Nina, or at least a grotesque mockery of her. Her skin was pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and black, her lips pulled back in a ghastly grin. A spectral blue light emanated from her form, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding snow. Ekaterina gasped, her grip tightening on the ice axe. Nina, what happened to you? Nina's spectral form glided closer, her eyes fixed on Ekaterina with an unnerving intensity. Join us, Ekaterina, she whispered, her voice a chilling echo of its former self. The light, it calls to us all. Ekaterina stumbled back, her mind reeling. This was not the Nina she knew, the kind, gentle soul who had been her friend. This was something else, something twisted and corrupted. No, Ekaterina said, her voice firm despite the terror that gripped her. I won't let it take me. Nina's eyes narrowed, the blue light intensifying. You cannot resist, she hissed. The light consumes all. It is your destiny. With a sudden, swift movement, Nina lunged towards Ekaterina, her spectral hands reaching out like claws. Ekaterina cried out, raising her ice axe in defense. The axe met Nina's form with a sickening thud, passing through her as if she were made of smoke. Nina recoiled, a look of surprise and frustration on her spectral face. You cannot harm me, she snarled. I am beyond your reach. Ekaterina, her heart pounding, knew she had to escape. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She could hear Nina's chilling laughter echoing behind her, a haunting reminder of the fate that awaited her if she failed. Ekaterina scrambled through the snow, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The darkness seemed to press in on her, the wind whipping at her face, the ghostly laughter echoing in her ears. She dared not look back, but she could sense Nina's presence, a chilling aura that pursued her relentlessly. She stumbled and fell, her hands sinking into the icy snow. Panic surged through her, threatening to overwhelm her. She had to get away, had to find somewhere to hide. But where? The landscape was a barren expanse of snow and shadows, offering no sanctuary. Then, she saw it, a faint glow emanating from a cluster of rocks ahead. It was a cave, its entrance partially obscured by a curtain of ice. Hope surged through her. Perhaps she could find refuge there, at least for a while. She scrambled towards the cave, her breath ragged, her muscles screaming in protest. She reached the entrance and slipped through the icy curtain, plunging into the darkness within. The cave was small, its walls damp and cold. The faint glow came from a fissure in the ceiling, a sliver of moonlight filtering through the ice and snow. Ekaterina huddled in a corner, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She listened intently, but could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart and the drip of water from the cave's ceiling. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What was happening to her? What was this force that haunted the mountains, that had corrupted her friend and now pursued her relentlessly? Suddenly, a voice whispered her name. Ekaterina. She opened her eyes, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing before her, bathed in the ethereal moonlight, was Alexei. But like Nina, he was a spectral apparition, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes hollow and black. Alexei, she whispered, her voice barely a croak. Is it really you? Alexei's spectral form glided closer, his lips curving into a chilling smile. "Join us, Ekaterina," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. "The light, it embraces us all." Ekaterina shrank back, her hand instinctively reaching for the ice axe. "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't." Alexei's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. "You cannot escape," he hissed. "The light claims all. It is your destiny." He lunged towards her, his spectral hands reaching for her throat. Ekaterina screamed, raising her ice axe in defense, but as before, the axe passed through him, striking nothing but air. Alexei's laughter echoed through the cave, a chilling sound that sent shivers down her spine. He reached for her again, his grip closing around her arm. Ekaterina cried out, struggling to break free. Then, a voice boomed through the cave, a voice filled with power and authority. "Leave her be." A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with piercing blue eyes and a flowing white beard. He wore a long, fur-lined coat and carried a staff topped with a carved wooden bird. Alexei recoiled, his spectral form flickering in the presence of the newcomer. "Who are you?" he hissed. The man's eyes flashed with an otherworldly light. "I am the guardian of these mountains," he said, his voice resonating with ancient power. "And I will not allow you to harm this girl." Alexei snarled, his spectral form flickering wildly. "You dare interfere?" he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "She belongs to the light. You cannot stop us." The guardian raised his staff, the carved bird at its tip seeming to come alive, its wings fluttering as if about to take flight. A wave of energy pulsed from the staff, washing over Alexei, causing him to shriek in agony. His form wavered, becoming translucent, then fading altogether with a final, despairing wail. Ekaterina stared in astonishment, her fear momentarily forgotten. Who was this man, this guardian of the mountains? And what was the light that Alexei had spoken of? The guardian turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "You are fortunate, child," he said, his voice gentle now. "The light almost claimed you." Ekaterina, still trembling from her encounter, found her voice. "What is the light?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to my friends?" The guardian sighed, his gaze turning towards the cave entrance. "The light is an ancient and powerful force," he explained. "It exists in the spaces between worlds, a realm of shadows and whispers. It feeds on fear and despair, drawing lost souls into its embrace." He paused, his expression growing grim. "Your friends, they were drawn to the light. It seduced them with promises of power and knowledge, but it twisted them, corrupted them, turning them into its servants." Ekaterina felt a wave of grief wash over her. So her friends were truly lost, their souls consumed by the darkness. But why? Why had the light chosen them? The guardian seemed to read her thoughts. "The light seeks those who are vulnerable, those who are lost and alone," he said. "It preys on their fears, their insecurities, their deepest desires. It offers them a way out, a way to escape the pain and suffering of this world. But the price is their very soul." He turned back to Ekaterina, his eyes filled with compassion. "You, child, are different. You have a strength within you, a resilience that the light cannot penetrate. You have faced your fears, your grief, and you have emerged stronger. That is why you were able to resist its pull." Ekaterina felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. Perhaps the guardian was right. Perhaps she did have the strength to overcome the darkness that had consumed her friends. But what could she do? How could she fight against a force so ancient and powerful? The guardian smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You are not alone, Ekaterina," he said. "There are others who fight against the light, who protect this world from its insidious influence. I will guide you to them. Together, you can learn to harness your strength, to fight back against the darkness." Ekaterina felt a surge of gratitude and determination. She would not let her friends' deaths be in vain. She would join the fight against the light, and she would ensure that no one else suffered the same fate. The guardian led her out of the cave, into the cold night air. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery light on the snow-covered landscape. Ekaterina took a deep breath, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a newfound strength coursing through her veins. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, filled with danger and uncertainty. But Ekaterina was ready. She had faced the darkness, and she had found the courage to fight back. She would not rest until the light was vanquished, and the souls of her friends were finally at peace. The Amityville Horror, a tale of blood and shadows. The salty tang of the Atlantic hung heavy in the air as George Lutz steered the station wagon down Ocean Avenue. Beside him, Kathy, her blonde hair whipping in the wind, pointed excitedly towards a house in the distance. It stood proud, a stately Dutch colonial with a gambrel roof and dormer windows that glinted like watchful eyes in the afternoon sun. "There it is!" she exclaimed, her voice laced with anticipation. 112 Ocean Avenue. Our new beginning. In the back seat, their 3 children, Danny, Christopher, and little Missy, bounced in their seats, their chatter a symphony of youthful excitement. George, a man who prized logic and reason above all else, couldn't help but share their enthusiasm. The house was a steal, a sprawling estate on a prime piece of Long Island real estate. He dismissed the whispers about its dark history, the tragic murders that had taken place within its walls just a year prior. A family named DeFeo, 6 souls extinguished in the cold November night. Just a terrible tragedy, he'd assured Kathy, his voice firm, nothing more. But as they pulled up the long, gravel driveway, a shiver ran down his spine. The house loomed large, casting an imposing shadow that seemed to stretch out and engulf them. The December air, already frigid, grew colder, a palpable chill that seeped into their bones. The children, oblivious to the growing unease, tumbled out of the car, their laughter echoing against the silent facade of the house. George, forcing a smile, turned to Kathy. "What do you think?" Kathy hesitated, her gaze lingering on the dormer windows, each one like a dark, vacant eye. "It's certainly grand," she replied, her voice a touch hesitant. He took her hand, his grip reassuring. "Come on, let's explore our new home." The front door, heavy and ornate, creaked open as if reluctant to reveal the secrets within. The foyer was vast and dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. A grand staircase swept upwards, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor. As they ventured deeper into the house, a sense of unease settled over them. The rooms were cavernous, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb the light. An oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the creaking floorboards beneath their feet. George, ever the pragmatist, pushed aside his apprehension. He envisioned roaring fires in the fireplaces, the laughter of his children echoing through the hallways, family dinners in the spacious dining room. This house, despite its tragic past, would be their sanctuary, a place to build new memories and leave the shadows behind. But as dusk settled over Amityville, and the shadows lengthened, a sense of foreboding crept in. The house, with its dark history and unsettling atmosphere, seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as if something sinister lurked just beneath the surface, ready to awaken. The first few nights were punctuated by a symphony of unsettling sounds. Floorboards groaned beneath unseen feet, doors creaked open and slammed shut with a jarring bang, and the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the eaves, its voice morphing into chilling moans and guttural growls. Sleep offered little respite. George was plagued by vivid nightmares, visions of shadowy figures with malevolent eyes, and the chilling echo of gunshots. Kathy would wake with a gasp, her heart pounding, convinced that something was watching her from the darkness. During the day, a pervasive chill clung to certain areas of the house, defying the warmth of the fireplaces. Missy, their youngest, began talking to an unseen presence. "Little boy with red eyes," she called Jody. Her brothers, initially amused, grew increasingly disturbed by her conversations with thin air. One evening, as Kathy prepared dinner, a swarm of flies materialized in the kitchen, their buzzing a maddening drone. She swatted at them frantically, a growing sense of dread creeping up her spine. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she felt a cold, unseen hand brush against her cheek, a fleeting touch that left her skin crawling. George, a man of logic and reason, tried to rationalize the strange occurrences. Old houses settled, he argued, drafts were common, and children had overactive imaginations. But deep down, a gnawing unease took root. He found himself increasingly irritable, his temper short, his patience thin. He spent hours in the basement, ostensibly fixing the old furnace, but in reality, he was drawn to the oppressive darkness, the palpable sense of something unseen lurking just beyond his perception. Kathy, a devout Catholic, began to pray more fervently, clutching her rosary beads like a lifeline. She hung crucifixes in every room, their silver gleam a stark contrast to the dark wood paneling. But the unsettling events continued, escalating in intensity. A vase toppled from the mantelpiece, shattering on the hearth. A heavy painting crashed to the floor in the dead of night. One morning, Kathy found all the kitchen chairs overturned, as if a struggle had taken place while they slept. The children, too, were affected. Danny, the eldest, grew withdrawn and sullen, his once bright eyes clouded with fear. Christopher, normally boisterous, became clingy, refusing to be alone, even for a moment. And Missy, her conversations with Jody growing more frequent and intense, began to exhibit disturbing behavior, drawing macabre pictures of shadowy figures and whispering about bad things happening in the house. The once happy home was now shrouded in a pall of fear and suspicion. The Lutz family, trapped in a spiral of escalating terror, were becoming strangers to each other, each grappling with their own growing dread, their own terrifying encounters with the unseen. The house, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, was slowly transforming into a prison of fear, its shadows closing in, threatening to consume them all. The basement, with its damp, earthen smell and oppressive darkness, had always been a place of unease. But it was George who felt the strongest pull, an inexplicable urge to delve into its depths. One chilly afternoon, armed with a flashlight, he ventured down the creaking wooden stairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. He navigated through the labyrinth of cobweb-laden storage rooms, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Then, he stumbled upon a door he hadn't noticed before, concealed behind a stack of old boxes. It was a small, unassuming door, painted a dull gray, but an icy wave of dread washed over him as he reached for the handle. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a small, square room. Its walls were painted a disturbing shade of crimson, the color seeming to pulsate with an unnatural vibrancy. The air within was thick and stagnant, heavy with an oppressive malevolence that made George's breath catch in his throat. He shone his flashlight around, but there was nothing to see, just 4 red walls and a floor of bare concrete. Yet, the feeling of evil was palpable, a suffocating presence that seemed to press down on him, stealing his breath. He backed out of the room, slamming the door shut, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had stumbled upon the heart of the house's darkness, the source of the terror that plagued them. This was the Red Room, a place whispered about in hushed tones by those who knew the house's history, a place where evil festered, where the veil between worlds was thin. News of the Red Room sent a fresh wave of fear through the family. The paranormal activity intensified, as if angered by their discovery. Objects flew across rooms with alarming force, shattering against the walls. The stench of sulfur grew stronger, permeating every corner of the house. And Missy's imaginary friend, Jody, became more malevolent, his voice a chilling whisper that promised pain and suffering. One night, the terror reached its peak. The family huddled together in the living room, the fireplace casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from upstairs. It was Danny. George and Kathy raced to his room, their hearts pounding with fear. They found him cowering in the corner, his eyes wide with terror, pointing towards the window. "It's there!" he screamed, his voice raw with panic. "The red eyes. It's watching me." They looked towards the window, but saw nothing. Then, a gust of icy wind swept through the room, slamming the window open with a deafening crash. The temperature plummeted, and a wave of palpable evil washed over them. Kathy felt a hand, cold and clammy, grip her arm, its touch burning like ice. George, his fear giving way to rage, grabbed a crucifix from the wall and held it aloft. "Get out!" he roared, his voice echoing through the house. "Leave us alone." A guttural growl, deep and menacing, answered him. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening, and a sense of suffocating dread filled the air. Then, as quickly as it began, the presence vanished. The temperature returned to normal, the wind subsided, and the only sound was their own ragged breathing. But the encounter left them shaken to their core. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were no longer dealing with mere ghostly apparitions. This was something ancient and malevolent, something that fed on their fear, something that wanted them gone, or worse. The decision to leave was swift and unanimous. There was no discussion, no weighing of pros and cons. Survival instinct took over, overriding any lingering attachment to their dream home. In the dead of night, they packed a few essentials, throwing clothes and toiletries into suitcases with trembling hands. There was no time for sentimentality, no looking back. The house, once a beacon of hope, was now a source of terror, a place they couldn't escape fast enough. George, his face pale and drawn, carried Missy, who clung to him, her small body trembling. Kathy shepherded the boys, their eyes wide with fear, their faces etched with the horrors they had witnessed. They crept out of the house like fugitives, leaving behind a lifetime of possessions, their dreams, and a part of their sanity. As they drove away, the house receded into the darkness, its silhouette a menacing shadow against the night sky. No one spoke. The silence in the car was thick with fear, exhaustion, and the lingering sense of disbelief. They had escaped, but the memories, the chilling encounters, the palpable evil, clung to them like a shroud. The aftermath was a blur of sleepless nights, frantic phone calls, and whispered conversations. They sought refuge with Kathy's family, their story met with a mixture of skepticism and concern. The horrors they described seemed too fantastical, too outlandish to be believed. But the terror in their eyes, the lingering trauma etched on their faces, spoke volumes. George, once a pillar of strength and reason, was a shadow of his former self. He was haunted by nightmares, plagued by flashbacks of the Red Room and the chilling growl that had echoed through the house. He grew increasingly withdrawn, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. The darkness of Amityville had seeped into his soul, leaving him scarred and broken. Kathy, her faith shaken, sought solace in prayer, but found little comfort. The unseen hand that had caressed her cheek, the icy grip on her arm, the feeling of being constantly watched, haunted her waking moments. She felt a profound sense of violation, as if the evil had not only invaded their home, but also their very beings. The children, too, bore the scars of their ordeal. Danny remained withdrawn and fearful, his childhood innocence shattered. Christopher clung to his mother, seeking reassurance in her touch. And Missy, though too young to fully comprehend the horrors she had witnessed, continued to talk about Jody, her imaginary friend, his presence a constant reminder of the darkness that had invaded their lives. Years passed, But the Amityville house remained a haunting presence in their lives. The questions lingered. Was it truly haunted? Or was it all a figment of their imaginations, a collective delusion born of stress and fear? The truth, like the shadows that clung to the house, remained elusive, shrouded in mystery and ambiguity. The Amityville house stood as a silent testament to the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary places. It was a reminder that evil can wear many faces, that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we see, but the ones we feel, the ones that whisper in the shadows, feeding on our fear, leaving us forever changed. The Hinterkaifeck horror. The snow fell relentlessly, a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the world outside the farmhouse. It was the kind of snow that muffled sound, isolating us in a world of white silence. I watched it fall from my bedroom window, a sense of unease settling in my stomach like a stone. It wasn't just the snow, it was the footprints. Earlier that morning, Papa had discovered them. A trail of deep impressions leading from the edge of the forest straight to our back door. But there were no returning tracks. Just some lost traveler, Papa had declared, his voice gruff, attempting to mask the worry creasing his brow. But Mama, her face pale and drawn, had muttered about bad omens and whispered prayers for protection. I, Victoria Gabriel, 16 years old and burdened with a heart that sensed things others didn't, felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The footprints weren't the only unsettling occurrence. For weeks, a sense of unease had been growing within the walls of our old farmhouse. Objects would be misplaced, a misplaced tool here, a missing shawl there. At night, I'd hear creaks and groans from the attic, sounds that Papa dismissed as the old house settling. But I knew better. There was something else here, something unseen, something watching. My little brother, Joseph, just 6 years old, claimed to see a man lurking in the woods, his eyes wide with childish fear. "There's a man out there, Victoria," he'd whispered, clutching my hand. "He's tall and has no face." Mama had soothed him, telling him it was just his imagination, but I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of dread. The snow continued to fall, the footprints reappearing each morning, a constant reminder that we were not alone. The unsettling noises in the attic grew more frequent, accompanied by whispers that seemed to slither through the walls at night. Even Papa, with his stoic facade, couldn't hide his growing concern. One particularly bleak evening, as the wind howled like a banshee outside, a stranger arrived at our doorstep. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and his eyes filled with a desperate hunger. Papa, despite his reservations, invited him in, offering him warmth and shelter from the storm. The stranger, who introduced himself as Carl, accepted with a gratitude that seemed a little too fervent, a little too eager. From the moment Carl stepped into our home, the atmosphere shifted. The unsettling occurrences intensified. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper. I felt a constant prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were following my every move. And then there were the dreams. Vivid, disturbing dreams of a dark figure, faceless and menacing, standing at the foot of my bed, its presence suffocating me. One morning, I awoke to find my room in disarray. Drawers were pulled open, their contents strewn across the floor. My diary, which I kept hidden beneath my mattress, lay open on my bedside table, its pages filled with my deepest fears and anxieties exposed. Panic seized me. Someone had been in my room. Someone had been reading my private thoughts. I confronted Carl, my voice trembling with accusation. He denied any involvement, but his eyes held a flicker of something dark, something that sent a chill down my spine. Mama, her fears now amplified, pleaded with Papa to send Carl away. But Papa, stubborn as ever, refused. "He's just a poor soul in need of help," he insisted. "We can't turn him away in this weather." But as the days turned into weeks, Even Papa couldn't deny the growing darkness that had enveloped our home. The livestock grew agitated, their panicked cries echoing through the barn at night. Joseph's nightmares worsened, his cries of terror echoing through the house. And then, the disappearances began. First, it was our dog, Gretchen, who vanished without a trace. Then, one of the farmhands, a young man named Franz, failed to return from his morning chores. Papa, his face etched with worry, organized a search party, but they found nothing. Franz had vanished, swallowed by the snow and the growing shadows that clung to our farm. The fear that had been simmering within us now boiled over. We were no longer just isolated. We were trapped, hunted by an unseen predator. Mama, her eyes wide with terror, barricaded the doors and windows, while Papa, armed with his hunting rifle, patrolled the house, his face grim and determined. One night, as I lay awake, listening to the wind howling outside, I heard a soft scratching sound coming from the attic. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was Carl. He was up there, lurking in the shadows, watching us. I crept out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. With trembling hands, I lit an oil lamp and made my way towards the attic stairs. The scratching sound grew louder as I ascended, accompanied by a low, guttural whispering that sent shivers down my spine. I pushed open the attic door, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the dusty room. And then I saw him. Carl was crouched in the corner, his back to me. He was muttering to himself, his voice a low, unintelligible chant. But it wasn't just his presence that terrified me. It was the object he held in his hands. It was my diary. He turned, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and a smile spread across his face, a smile that was both predatory and triumphant. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered, his voice raspy and chilling. "The darkness, it's calling to you." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. "What are you talking about?" I stammered. "It's here, Victoria," he hissed, his voice filled with a strange, almost ecstatic fervor. "It's been here all along, waiting for us. And now, it's chosen you." He lunged towards me, his hands outstretched, and I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty attic. I raised the lamp, its flame flickering wildly, and brought it down on his head. He cried out, stumbling back, and I fled, my heart pounding in my chest. I raced down the stairs, my mind reeling. Carl was not just a drifter. He was something more, something sinister. He was connected to the darkness that had invaded our home, the darkness that was now closing in on us. I burst into the main room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Mama and Papa stared at me, their faces etched with fear. "He's up there," I cried, pointing towards the attic. "He's gone mad." Papa grabbed his rifle and raced towards the stairs, Mama close behind. I followed, my fear giving way to a strange sense of determination. I had to protect my family. I had to stop Carl, even if it meant facing the darkness that he embodied. We reached the attic, but Carl was gone. The only evidence of his presence was the shattered oil lamp and the lingering scent of something ancient and evil. Papa cursed, his face pale with frustration. "Where did he go?" he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. And then we heard it, a scream, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house. It was Joseph. We raced towards his room, our hearts pounding in our chests. The door was open, and a scene of unimaginable horror greeted us. Joseph lay on his bed, his small body twisted and broken, his eyes wide with terror, and standing over him, his hands dripping with blood, was Carl. "He's mine now," Carl hissed, his voice filled with a triumphant glee. "He's part of the darkness now." Papa roared with rage and charged at Carl, his rifle raised. But Carl was too quick. He dodged Papa's attack and lunged at Mama, his hands closing around her throat. Mama gasped, her eyes bulging, and I screamed, my voice raw with despair. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and charged at Carl, my fury giving me strength. I swung the poker with all my might, striking him across the back. He cried out in pain, releasing Mama, and stumbled back. Papa seized the opportunity, tackling Carl to the ground. They wrestled, their grunts and curses filling the room. I rushed to Mama's side, her body limp and lifeless in my arms. Mama! I cried, my voice choked with sobs. Mama, please wake up. But Mama didn't move. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, her skin cold and lifeless. My heart shattered into a million pieces. My Mama, my sweet, gentle Mama, was gone. The struggle between Papa and Carl continued, their bodies rolling across the floor. Carl, fueled by an unnatural strength, managed to overpower Papa, pinning him to the ground. He raised his hands, his fingers curled into claws, ready to deliver the final blow. And then, something extraordinary happened. The room grew cold, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The shadows deepened, swirling around Carl like a living entity. And from the depths of those shadows, a voice emerged, a voice that was ancient and chilling, a voice that seemed to echo from the very depths of hell. No, the voice boomed, its power shaking the very foundations of the house. He is mine. Carl froze, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows coiled around him, tightening their grip. He screamed, his voice filled with agony, as the darkness consumed him. His body contorted, his bones snapping and twisting, his flesh melting away like wax. Papa scrambled back, his eyes wide with horror, as Carl's screams filled the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness receded, leaving behind only a pile of dust and a lingering sense of evil. The room was silent. Papa lay on the floor, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on the spot where Carl had vanished. I knelt beside Mama, my tears falling onto her cold, lifeless face. Joseph's lifeless body lay on the bed, a stark reminder of the innocence that had been stolen from us. We were alone. The darkness had taken everything from us. Our family, our home, our peace. We were left with nothing but grief, despair, and the chilling knowledge that the evil that had haunted our farm was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victims. I closed Mama's eyes, a single tear tracing a path down my cheek. I knew then that I would never be the same. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, once a place of warmth and love, was now a tomb, a monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. And I, Victoria Gabriel, was forever scarred by the darkness that had consumed my family. The snow continued to fall, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded. And as I looked out at the desolate landscape, I knew that the evil that had haunted Hinterkaifeck was not gone. It was simply waiting, patiently, for its next opportunity to rise from the shadows and claim its victims. The shadow of the Mothman. The air in Point Pleasant hung heavy, thick with the scent of pine needles and the unspoken dread that clung to the town like a shroud. It had been decades since the Silver Bridge tragedy, yet the shadow of the Mothman still lingered, a chilling reminder of the day the town's lifeline crumbled into the icy Ohio River. I, Jake Davies, a freelance journalist with a penchant for the paranormal, had arrived in this sleepy West Virginia town seeking answers, hoping to unravel the mystery that had haunted Point Pleasant for generations. My interest in the Mothman stemmed from a childhood fascination with the unexplained. Growing up, I devoured every book and article I could find on cryptids, those creatures that existed on the fringes of reality, defying scientific explanation. The Mothman, with its terrifying description, a 7-foot-tall humanoid figure with glowing red eyes and enormous wings, held a particular grip on my imagination. My arrival in Point Pleasant was met with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The locals, hardened by years of whispers and speculation, were hesitant to discuss the creature that had become synonymous with their town. However, the more I delved into the town's history, the more I realized that the Mothman was more than just a local legend. It was a deeply ingrained part of their collective consciousness, a dark secret that refused to be forgotten. My first lead came in the form of an elderly woman named Mrs. Evelyn Thomas, who claimed to have encountered the Mothman in the weeks leading up to the Silver Bridge collapse. Her voice trembled as she recounted her experience, her eyes wide with fear even after all these years. "It was a cold November night," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was driving home from church when I saw it standing by the side of the road. Its eyes, those red eyes, they burned into me like fire. I slammed on the brakes, and it just vanished." Mrs. Thomas's encounter wasn't unique. I soon discovered a pattern of sightings preceding the bridge disaster. Witnesses described strange lights in the sky, eerie sounds emanating from the woods, and a pervasive sense of unease that permeated the town. Many believed the Mothman was a harbinger of doom, a creature that appeared only to warn of impending tragedy. Intrigued, I began to explore the areas where the Mothman had been sighted. The abandoned TNT plant, a sprawling complex of decaying buildings and rusted machinery, was a popular spot for alleged encounters. Locals claimed the creature nested within the plant's labyrinthine tunnels, emerging only under the cover of darkness. One night, armed with a flashlight and a voice recorder, I ventured into the plant. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional scuttling of rats. As I navigated the maze of corridors, a sense of dread washed over me. I felt watched, as if unseen eyes were following my every move. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech echoed through the darkness, sending chills down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, searching for the source of the sound. The beam of my flashlight danced across the shadows, revealing nothing but crumbling walls and rusted pipes. Then, I saw them. Two glowing red eyes, peering at me from the darkness at the end of the corridor. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, filled with an intelligence that was both ancient and malevolent. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the creature stepped into the light. It was the Mothman. Its towering figure filled the corridor, its wings folded against its back like a grotesque cloak. Its eyes, those terrifying red eyes, bore into me, seeming to pierce my very soul. I stumbled backward, my voice caught in my throat, as the creature let out another ear-piercing screech. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I fled the plant, my heart pounding in my ears. The image of the creature burned into my mind. I had seen the Mothman, and I knew then that it was no mere legend. It was real, and it was terrifying. The encounter left me shaken, but it also fueled my determination to uncover the truth. I spent the following days poring over old newspaper articles, police reports, and eyewitness accounts, piecing together the history of the Mothman sightings. I discovered that the creature had been reported not just in Point Pleasant, but in other parts of the world as well, often in connection with disasters or strange occurrences. Was the Mothman truly a harbinger of doom? Or was there a more rational explanation for its appearance? I began to explore alternative theories, researching everything from mass hysteria to government conspiracies. One theory that caught my attention involved a secret government experiment conducted in the area. According to this theory, the Mothman was a byproduct of the experiment, a creature accidentally unleashed from another dimension. This theory, while far-fetched, seemed to explain the creature's bizarre appearance and its connection to strange phenomena. As I delved deeper into the conspiracy, I discovered a network of individuals who believed the government was actively covering up the truth about the Mothman. They claimed the creature was a threat to national security, and that the authorities were desperate to keep its existence a secret. I contacted one of these individuals, a former government employee named Mr. Johnson, who agreed to meet me in a secluded diner outside of town. He arrived looking nervous, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected to be followed. "The Mothman is real," he said, his voice low and urgent. "And it's more dangerous than you can imagine. The government knows about it, but they're doing everything they can to keep it under wraps." Mr. Johnson claimed to have seen classified documents detailing the government's involvement with the Mothman. He described a top-secret project aimed at harnessing the creature's power for military purposes. The project, he said, had gone horribly wrong, resulting in the creature's escape and the subsequent sightings in Point Pleasant. "They're afraid of what it can do," Mr. Johnson continued. "They're afraid of the panic it could cause if the public knew the truth." I left the diner with more questions than answers. Was Mr. Johnson telling the truth? Or was he simply another victim of the town's collective paranoia? I decided to investigate further, seeking out more evidence to support his claims. My search led me to a hidden archive within the local library, a collection of documents and artifacts related to the Mothman legend. Among the dusty tomes and faded photographs, I discovered a journal belonging to a former researcher who had studied the creature in the 1960s. The journal contained detailed observations of the Mothman's behavior, along with theories about its origins and purpose. The researcher believed the creature was not a harbinger of doom, but rather a guardian, a protector of the natural world. He theorized that the Mothman appeared only when the balance of nature was threatened, warning humans of the consequences of their actions. This new perspective intrigued me. Could the Mothman be a benevolent entity, misunderstood and feared due to its terrifying appearance? Was it possible that the creature was trying to warn us about something far greater than ourselves? As I pondered these questions, a chilling realization dawned on me. The Silver Bridge collapse, the chemical spills, the industrial pollution. All of these events could be seen as disruptions to the natural order. Perhaps the Mothman wasn't a harbinger of doom, but a messenger, a desperate attempt to alert us to the damage we were inflicting on the planet. This realization filled me with a sense of urgency. If the Mothman was indeed a guardian, then its appearance in Point Pleasant could be a sign that something catastrophic was about to happen. I had to warn the town, to convince them that the creature was not their enemy. But how could I convince a town steeped in fear and suspicion? How could I convince them to trust a creature they had come to associate with death and destruction? I decided to organize a town hall meeting, inviting everyone to share their experiences and discuss the Mothman phenomenon. The meeting was tense, filled with a mix of fear, skepticism, and anger. Some accused me of fear-mongering, while others clung to the belief that the Mothman was a malevolent entity. But as the night wore on, a shift began to occur. People started to listen, to share their stories, to acknowledge the possibility that the Mothman might not be what they thought it was. And then, it happened. A woman in the back of the room stood up, her face pale and drawn. "I saw it," she whispered. "Just last night. It was standing in my backyard, staring at me with those red eyes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, another person spoke up and another, until the room was filled with voices, each sharing their own encounter with the creature. It was as if the town's collective fear had finally found an outlet, a shared space where they could confront their anxieties and fears. As the meeting drew to a close, a sense of unity had emerged. The town of Point Pleasant, once divided by fear and suspicion, had come together to face the unknown. They had acknowledged the existence of the Mothman, not as a harbinger of doom, but as a mysterious entity that might hold the key to their future. I left Point Pleasant with a renewed sense of purpose. The Mothman remained an enigma, a creature that defied easy explanation. But I knew one thing for sure: the town of Point Pleasant would never be the same. They had faced their fears, embraced the unknown, and emerged stronger than ever before. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but feel that the shadow of the Mothman, once a symbol of fear and despair, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. The sleepless, the fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the sterile white hallways. Dr. Alex Walker, his breath misting in the chilled air, clutched his briefcase tighter, the leather cold against his knuckles. He'd been summoned to this desolate research facility in the dead of night, the secrecy surrounding his arrival as thick as the fog rolling in from the distant coast. Project Somnus, the stern-faced guard had said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Dr. Walker, you've been selected for a highly classified project. Your expertise in neurochemistry is essential. Alex, a young man with a thirst for knowledge and a naive belief in the good of scientific progress, had felt a thrill course through him. He was being offered a chance to be part of something groundbreaking, something that could change the world. Now, standing in the heart of this isolated complex, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of machinery and the distant echo of his own footsteps. He was led through a labyrinth of corridors, each turn seemingly identical to the last. Finally, he reached a heavy steel door, emblazoned with the project's ominous name. Inside, a stark white room awaited, filled with an array of monitors, wires, and medical equipment. A group of men in white coats, their faces etched with fatigue and a disturbing intensity, turned to greet him. Dr. Walker, a tall man with steely gray eyes, stepped forward. I'm Dr. Richard Harding, lead researcher on Project Somnus. Welcome. His handshake was firm, his grip bordering on aggressive. Thank you, Dr. Harding, Alex replied, trying to maintain his composure. I'm eager to learn more about this project. Harding gestured towards a row of monitors displaying grainy images of figures lying in beds. As you know, the aim of Project Somnus is to eliminate the need for sleep in humans. Imagine the possibilities: soldiers who can fight without rest, scientists who can work around the clock, a world free from the limitations of sleep. Alex nodded, his initial excitement returning. The implications were indeed staggering, but a nagging question tugged at his mind. And the subjects? He asked. Where did you find volunteers willing to undergo such an experimental procedure? Harding's lips tightened. Let's just say the government has ways of procuring necessary personnel. He turned towards the monitors. Our initial trials have been promising. The subjects are exhibiting increased alertness, enhanced cognitive function, and significantly reduced reaction times. Alex peered at the screens, his gaze lingering on the gaunt faces and vacant eyes of the figures strapped to the beds. He felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Something about their stillness, their unnatural immobility, seemed deeply unsettling. Days turned into weeks, and Alex found himself immersed in the project. He analyzed data, monitored the subject's vital signs, and assisted in the administration of the experimental drug, a potent cocktail of stimulants and neurochemicals designed to suppress the sleep centers of the brain. The initial success was undeniable. The subjects remained awake for days, even weeks on end, their performance exceeding all expectations. But as the experiment progressed, so did the side effects. The subjects grew increasingly agitated, their behavior erratic. They suffered from hallucinations, paranoia, and violent outbursts. Alex began to notice disturbing patterns in their speech, fragmented sentences filled with cryptic phrases and nonsensical ramblings. One evening, while reviewing the observation logs, he stumbled upon a chilling entry from Subject 4A, a former soldier. The shadows whisper. They tell me things. They show me the abyss. It's hungry. We are all falling. Alex felt a cold dread grip his heart. He brought his concerns to Dr. Harding, but the lead researcher remained dismissive. These are just minor setbacks, Walker, Harding said, his voice laced with impatience. The potential rewards far outweigh the risks. We are on the cusp of a scientific breakthrough. We cannot afford to waver now. But Alex couldn't shake off the growing sense of unease. He began spending his nights poring over the project's archives, searching for clues, for any indication of what was truly happening to the subjects. He discovered reports of previous failed experiments, of subjects driven to madness, of violent incidents that had been swept under the rug. He learned of the project's true origins, its connection to a shadowy government agency obsessed with creating super soldiers, unburdened by the limitations of human frailty. One night, while working late in the lab, he stumbled upon a hidden file, its contents encrypted. With trembling fingers, he managed to crack the code. What he found sent a wave of horror crashing over him. The experimental drug wasn't simply suppressing sleep. It was altering the very fabric of the subject's consciousness, pushing them to the brink of sanity, opening their minds to something else. The file contained disturbing images, sketches drawn by the subjects, depicting grotesque figures with elongated limbs and vacant eyes, lurking in the shadows. There were cryptic messages, warnings of an impending darkness, of a hunger that consumed all. Alex realized with sickening clarity that Project Somnus wasn't about progress. It was about control, about unleashing a force that could have devastating consequences. He had to stop it, expose the truth, no matter the cost. Driven by a desperate sense of urgency, he decided to contact a journalist he knew, a woman with a reputation for investigative reporting. He managed to slip her a coded message, detailing the horrors of the project, begging her to help. But his actions didn't go unnoticed. The next morning, he was summoned to Dr. Harding's office. The lead researcher's face was pale, his eyes burning with a cold fury. "Walker," he hissed, "we've been monitoring your activities. You've betrayed our trust. You've jeopardized everything." Alex felt a surge of fear, but he stood his ground. "This project is an abomination," he said, his voice trembling. "You're playing with fire, Harding. You're going to unleash something you can't control." Harding's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Control is an illusion, Walker. Power is all that matters. And we are on the verge of acquiring unimaginable power." He pressed a button on his desk, and two guards materialized from the shadows, their faces impassive. "Escort Dr. Walker to the isolation ward," Harding ordered. "He needs to be re-educated." Alex struggled, but the guards were too strong. They dragged him down the sterile hallways, his cries echoing unanswered. He was thrown into a small, windowless room, the steel door slamming shut behind him. He was alone, trapped in the heart of the beast he had helped to create. Days turned into an endless blur. He was subjected to interrogations, injected with sedatives, his mind probed for any remaining secrets. He caught glimpses of the other subjects, their bodies contorted, their eyes burning with a terrifying emptiness. The facility had become a living nightmare, a testament to the hubris of man and the horrors that lay hidden beneath the surface of scientific progress. One night, as he lay on the cold floor of his cell, his body racked with pain and exhaustion, he heard a scratching at the door. He looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Subject 4A, the former soldier. But he was no longer the man Alex remembered. His skin was pale and stretched taut over his bones, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His lips were pulled back in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharpened teeth. "They're coming," he rasped, his voice a guttural growl. "The shadows, they're hungry." He lunged at Alex, his claws outstretched. Alex screamed and scrambled back, his mind reeling in terror. He had become prey in his own nightmare, trapped in a world where sleep was no longer an escape, but a gateway to unimaginable horrors. The fight was brief and brutal. Alex, weakened and disoriented, was no match for the creature's superhuman strength. He felt sharp claws tear into his flesh, his blood splattering against the cold concrete floor. As darkness closed in, he saw a vision of the facility overrun by monstrous figures, their screams echoing through the night. Project Somnus had unleashed its final horror, and the world would never be the same. But even as his consciousness faded, a spark of defiance remained. He had failed to stop the experiment, but he had witnessed its horrors. And somewhere, out there in the darkness, the journalist he had contacted was working, piecing together the truth, preparing to expose the secrets of Project Somnus to the world. His sacrifice would not be in vain. The fight was not over. Annabelle's awakening. The air in the museum hung thick with the scent of dust and forgotten things. Moonlight streamed through the high windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the exhibits. A lone security guard, a weary man named George, patrolled the darkened corridors, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He paused before a glass case, its contents illuminated by a single spotlight. Inside, a Raggedy Ann doll with rosy cheeks and vacant eyes stared back at him. A small plaque beneath read, "Annabelle. Warning, positively do not open." George shivered, a prickle of unease crawling down his spine. He'd been working at the Warren Occult Museum for years, and he'd seen his fair share of unsettling artifacts. But there was something about Annabelle, something in those lifeless button eyes, that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He quickly moved on, his heart thudding a little faster than usual. Unbeknownst to George, a group of teenagers had slipped into the museum after closing hours. They were thrill-seekers, drawn by the museum's reputation and the legend of Annabelle. The leader, a brash young man named Jake, had dared his friends to break into the museum and take a picture with the infamous doll. "Don't be such a scaredy cat, Mark," Jake sneered, seeing the hesitation on his friend's face. "It's just a stupid doll. What's the worst that could happen?" Mark, a sensitive and imaginative boy, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He'd read about Annabelle online, about the strange occurrences and violent attacks attributed to the doll. He didn't believe in ghosts or demons, but something about this place, this doll, felt inherently wrong. Ignoring his misgivings, Mark followed his friends as they crept through the shadowy exhibits. They reached Annabelle's case, its glass gleaming ominously in the dim light. Jake produced a small glass cutter and began working on the lock, his movements swift and practiced. "Dude, what if we get caught?" whispered Emily, one of the girls in the group. "Relax," Jake muttered, his eyes fixed on the lock. "No one's gonna catch us. And besides, think of the story we'll have to tell." The lock clicked open, and Jake swung the case door wide. A wave of cold air washed over them, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine, and he could have sworn he heard a faint, childlike giggle echoing in the silence. Jake reached into the case and pulled Annabelle out, her limp body surprisingly heavy in his hands. He grinned, holding the doll aloft. "Say cheese," he said, snapping a picture with his phone. As the flash illuminated the room, a guttural growl ripped through the silence. The teenagers froze, their blood turning to ice. The growl seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the museum like the roar of a caged beast. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic seized the group. They stumbled back, bumping into each other in their desperate attempt to escape. "Jake, put the doll back," Mark yelled, his voice trembling. But it was too late. In the darkness, something moved. A small, unseen figure darted past them, its touch leaving a trail of icy coldness in its wake. Emily screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that echoed through the empty halls. Then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Mark fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he activated the flashlight. The beam of light danced across the room, revealing a scene of chaos. The glass case lay shattered on the floor, and Annabelle was gone. "Where is she?" Emily whimpered, her eyes wide with fear. Mark scanned the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw a shadow move in the corner of his eye, a small, hunched figure standing by the doorway. He slowly turned the flashlight towards it, his breath catching in his throat. Standing there, bathed in the pale light, was Annabelle. But something was different. Her eyes, once vacant and lifeless, now glowed with a malevolent red light. A cruel smile twisted her painted lips, and a single tear of blood trickled down her cheek. The teenagers stared in horror, paralyzed by fear. Then, Annabelle lunged. The teenagers scattered, their screams echoing through the museum's halls. Jake, in a moment of clarity, realized the gravity of his actions. He scrambled back towards the shattered case, desperate to put Annabelle back, to undo the chaos he had unleashed. But the doll was gone, vanished into the shadows. Mark, his heart pounding like a drum, found himself cornered in a room filled with ancient artifacts. He pressed himself against the wall, his eyes frantically searching the darkness. He could hear the others shouting, their voices filled with terror, but he couldn't tell where they were or what was happening. Suddenly, a cold hand clamped around his ankle. He gasped, his blood turning to ice. He looked down, his flashlight beam illuminating a pair of tiny, white hands gripping his leg. Annabelle's hands. With a strength that belied her size, she pulled him down, her ragged dress brushing against his face. He cried out, kicking and struggling, but her grip was unrelenting. He felt her breath on his skin, cold and fetid, like the air in a crypt. "Help me!" he screamed, his voice hoarse with fear. But no one came. He felt a sharp pain in his arm, and he looked down to see Annabelle's hand, impossibly sharp, raking across his flesh. Blood welled up, staining his shirt crimson. He thrashed, desperate to break free, but she held on tight, her red eyes burning into his. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to survive. He grabbed a nearby artifact, a heavy iron candlestick, and swung it at the doll. It connected with a sickening thud, and Annabelle's grip loosened. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran, blindly, through the maze of exhibits, the echoes of his own footsteps mingling with the terrified cries of his friends. He burst into the main hall, where he found Emily cowering behind a display case. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Mark!" she cried, relief flooding her voice. "We have to get out of here!" he gasped, grabbing her hand. They ran towards the front entrance, but the doors were locked. They rattled the handles, their desperation growing with each passing second. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Artifacts lay shattered on the floor, display cases were overturned, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. And standing in the middle of it all was Annabelle. She stood motionless, her red eyes fixed on them. A slow, malevolent smile spread across her face. Mark felt a wave of despair wash over him. They were trapped, cornered like rats in a cage. There was no escape. As Annabelle began to move towards them, her ragged dress trailing behind her like a shroud, Mark closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But the attack never came. Instead, a voice, deep and commanding, boomed through the hall. "Leave this place, demon. You have no power here." Mark opened his eyes to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was an elderly man, his face etched with years of wisdom and experience. He held a crucifix in one hand and a Bible in the other. The man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Annabelle. He began to recite a prayer, his voice resonating with power and authority. Annabelle recoiled, her red eyes flickering. She seemed to shrink back, her malevolent aura diminishing. The man continued to pray, his voice growing stronger. Annabelle let out a high-pitched wail, a sound of pure rage and frustration. Then, with a final, desperate shriek, she vanished. The teenagers stared in stunned silence. The man turned to them, his expression grave. "You have been foolish," he said, his voice stern. "This is not a place for games. You have tampered with forces beyond your understanding." He then introduced himself as Father Michael, a priest who had been called to the museum to deal with a disturbance. He had sensed the presence of evil and arrived just in time to witness the teenagers' encounter with Annabelle. Father Michael explained that Annabelle was not merely a haunted doll, but a conduit for a malevolent entity, a demon that sought to prey on human fear and vulnerability. He warned them never to return to the museum and to never again trifle with the supernatural. Shaken and humbled, the teenagers thanked Father Michael and fled the museum. their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. They never spoke of their experience again, the memory of that night forever etched in their minds. As for Annabelle, she remained locked away in her glass case, a silent reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of the world, waiting for the unwary to unleash it. The night never ends. The fog hung heavy over Whitechapel, clinging to the cobbled streets and gas lamps like a shroud. The year was 1888, and fear stalked the labyrinthine alleyways, a specter as relentless and chilling as the autumn winds that howled through the East End. Mary Kelly shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her slender frame. The night was bitter, and the gin she'd consumed earlier did little to ward off the cold. She glanced down Buck's Row, the dim light barely penetrating the swirling mist. It was a night like any other, filled with the usual cast of characters: drunken dockworkers, weary costers, and the occasional shadowy figure lurking in doorways. Mary, like many women in this impoverished district, walked the streets to survive. Tonight, however, a sense of unease gnawed at her. The usual boisterous chatter of the pubs seemed muted, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Even the stray dogs that roamed the streets seemed to have vanished. A figure emerged from the fog, his silhouette tall and imposing. Mary's heart quickened. He approached with a confident stride, his face obscured by the darkness and the brim of his hat. "Looking for company, miss?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Mary hesitated. Something about the man's demeanor set her on edge. But the night was growing late, and she needed to earn her keep. "Perhaps," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, a glint of teeth flashing in the dim light. "Then allow me to escort you." He offered his arm, and Mary, with a mixture of trepidation and resignation, took it. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the damp cobblestones. As they turned onto a narrow side street, the man stopped. He turned to Mary, his face now illuminated by a nearby gas lamp. His features were sharp and angular, his eyes dark and intense. "You have beautiful eyes," he said, his voice soft yet menacing. Mary tried to smile, but her lips felt frozen. She wanted to run, to scream, but fear paralyzed her. The man's hand reached out, caressing her cheek. His touch was cold, like the touch of death. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "It will all be over soon." The last thing Mary saw was the glint of a blade in the dim light. The following morning, Mary Kelly's mutilated body was discovered in a squalid room in Miller's Court. Her throat had been slashed, her abdomen ripped open, and her organs removed with surgical precision. The brutality of the murder shocked even the most hardened police officers. News of the gruesome crime spread like wildfire through Whitechapel. Panic gripped the East End as the realization dawned that a killer stalked the streets, a predator who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. The police, under immense pressure to catch the culprit, launched a massive investigation. Detectives scoured the streets, interviewed witnesses, and followed every lead, no matter how tenuous. But the killer, who the press had dubbed Jack the Ripper, remained elusive. Days turned into weeks, and the body count continued to rise. Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. Each victim met a gruesome end, their bodies bearing the same horrific mutilations. The Ripper, it seemed, was unstoppable. He moved like a phantom through the fog-shrouded streets, leaving a trail of death and terror in his wake. The police were baffled. The killer left no clues, no fingerprints, no witnesses who could provide a definitive description. He was a ghost, a nightmare made flesh. As the murders continued, the public's fear turned to outrage. The police were accused of incompetence, of failing to protect the citizens of Whitechapel. The pressure on the authorities mounted with each new victim. In a desperate attempt to catch the killer, the police employed a variety of tactics. They sent undercover officers into the streets, posing as prostitutes. They distributed leaflets warning women to stay indoors at night. They even consulted psychics and clairvoyants, hoping to gain some insight into the killer's mind. But all their efforts proved futile. Jack the Ripper remained a step ahead, his identity shrouded in mystery. One foggy evening, a young police constable named Edward Watkins was patrolling the streets of Whitechapel. He was a rookie, barely a year on the force, but he was determined to do his part to catch the killer who terrorized his city. As he walked down a narrow alleyway, he noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. The figure was tall and slender, dressed in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Watkins' heart pounded in his chest. Could this be the Ripper? He approached cautiously, his hand hovering over his truncheon. "Hello," he called out. "Can I help you?" The figure turned, and Watkins gasped. The man's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and piercing. He had a cruel smile on his lips and a glint of something sinister in his eyes. Watkins knew instinctively that he was facing the monster he had been hunting. "You're Jack the Ripper," he said, his voice trembling. The man chuckled. "That's what they call me, yes." Watkins drew his truncheon, his grip tightening. "You're under arrest." The Ripper laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the alleyway. "You can't stop me, Constable. I am the night. I am the fog. I am the fear that grips this city." He lunged at Watkins, a knife flashing in his hand. Watkins raised his truncheon to defend himself, but he was no match for the Ripper's strength and agility. The knife plunged into Watkins' chest, and the young constable crumpled to the ground. The Ripper stood over him, his face contorted in a mask of triumph. "Another victim for my collection," he whispered. He turned and vanished into the fog, leaving Watkins to bleed to death in the darkness. The murders continued, each one more brutal than the last. The city was gripped by terror, and the police seemed powerless to stop the carnage. Jack the Ripper became a legend, a boogeyman who haunted the nightmares of Londoners. His name was whispered in hushed tones, a symbol of fear and evil. The Ripper's reign of terror finally came to an end in November 1888, after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Her body was found in her room, mutilated beyond recognition. After Kelly's murder, the Ripper vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. The killings stopped, and the city slowly began to breathe again. But the mystery of Jack the Ripper remained. Who was he? Why did he kill? And how did he manage to evade capture? These questions have haunted investigators and armchair detectives for over a century. Numerous theories have been proposed, but none have been definitively proven. Jack the Ripper remains one of the most enigmatic figures in criminal history, a shadowy figure who continues to fascinate and terrify. His crimes serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks within the human soul, and the fragility of life in the face of evil. The haunting of Room 504. The Cecil Hotel loomed over Mark like a gothic predator, its chipped paint and cracked windows hinting at the decay within. He booked a room online, drawn in by the cheap rates and central location. He knew nothing of the hotel's grim reputation, the whispers of suicides, murders, and disappearances that clung to its walls like cobwebs. The lobby was a dim, cavernous space, the air thick with the scent of dust and stale cigarette smoke. A lone clerk, his face etched with boredom and something akin to despair, handed Mark a tarnished key attached to a heavy brass fob. "Room 504, he mumbled, his eyes sliding away from Mark's gaze. The elevator groaned its way upwards, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed with the car's jerky ascent. Mark felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. He dismissed it as the natural apprehension of being alone in a strange place, but the feeling persisted, a cold, not tightening in his stomach. Room 504 was small and sparsely furnished, the faded wallpaper peeling away from the damp walls. A single window offered a view of a narrow alleyway, where overflowing dumpsters reeked and rats scurried in the shadows. Mark unpacked his suitcase, the silence broken only by the distant drone of traffic and the occasional shriek of a siren. As dusk settled over the city, the Cecil Hotel seemed to sink deeper into its own darkness. The hallways, dimly lit and seemingly endless, stretched out like the corridors of a labyrinth. Mark, restless and unable to shake off a growing sense of foreboding, decided to explore. He wandered aimlessly, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He passed closed doors, each one concealing its own unknown secrets. He imagined the lives lived and lost within these walls, the echoes of laughter and despair mingling in the stale air. He paused by an old, tarnished mirror, his reflection a pale ghost in the dim light. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure standing behind him, a woman with long, dark hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of ink. He turned, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. He returned to his room, the unsettling encounter leaving a lingering chill. He tried to read, to distract himself, but the words swam before his eyes. The silence pressed in on him, broken only by the creaking of the old building and the occasional drip of a leaky faucet. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, a sharp rap on the door jolted him awake. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear any further sound. Silence. He waited, every nerve on high alert, but the knocking didn't repeat. Cautiously, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was deserted. The next morning, Mark ventured out into the city, seeking refuge from the oppressive atmosphere of the hotel. He spent the day wandering the bustling streets, losing himself in the vibrant energy of Los Angeles. But as evening approached, the dread returned, a dark cloud shadowing his thoughts. Back in his room, sleep evaded him. He tossed and turned, plagued by disturbing dreams. He saw a young woman, her face contorted in terror, trapped in a confined space, water rising around her, filling her lungs. He woke with a gasp, drenched in a cold sweat. The woman's terrified eyes burned into his memory. Driven by a morbid curiosity, Mark began researching the Cecil Hotel's history. He delved into online forums, newspaper archives, and true crime documentaries. He learned of the hotel's long and sordid past, a litany of suicides, murders, and unexplained deaths. And then he stumbled upon the story of Elisa Lamb. Elisa, a young Canadian student, had vanished from the Cecil in 2013. Her body was later discovered in one of the water tanks on the roof, her death a mystery. Mark watched the chilling elevator footage of Elisa's last known moments, her erratic behavior, her frantic gestures, her apparent fear of something unseen. He recognized her, the woman from his nightmares. A cold dread settled over Mark. He felt a presence in the room, a subtle shift in the air, a whisper of something unseen. Objects seemed to move inexplicably, shadows deepened in the corners, and the faint scent of stagnant water clung to the air. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as his imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. He felt watched, followed. He would catch glimpses of movement in the periphery of his vision, a flicker of shadow, a fleeting impression of long, dark hair. The nightmares intensified, the image of the drowning woman haunting his every waking moment. One evening, as he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering television screen, he felt a cold breath on his neck. He whirled around, but there was nothing there. Yet the feeling remained, a lingering chill that seeped into his bones. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to know. He had to confront whatever was haunting him. Mark stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. "Elisa," he called out, his voice trembling slightly, "if you're here, show yourself." A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door shut with a resounding bang. The temperature plummeted, and a bone-chilling cold enveloped him. The mirror on the wall rippled and distorted, the reflection fragmenting into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. And then he saw her. Elisa's spectral form emerged from the mirror, her long black hair dripping with water, her eyes wide with fear and accusation. Mark stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a mournful echo that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "Why didn't you help me?" Mark, paralyzed with terror, could only stammer, I. I didn't know. Elisa's form flickered, her image growing more intense, her features contorted in a mask of anguish. You see me now, she wailed, her voice rising to a chilling crescendo. You will never forget. The room plunged into darkness, the only sound the frantic beating of Mark's heart. He stood frozen. The spectral image of Elisa burned into his mind. When the lights flickered back on, the room was empty, but the chilling presence remained, a palpable weight in the air. Mark didn't sleep for the rest of his stay. Every shadow held the thread of Elisa's form, every creak of the old building a whisper of her name. He checked out of the Cecil Hotel the next morning, his face pale and drawn, his eyes haunted by the horrors he had witnessed. He left Los Angeles, carrying the weight of Elisa's tragedy with him, forever scarred by his encounter with the ghost of the Cecil Hotel. Even now, years later, the nightmares still plague him. He sees Elisa's face in the darkness, hears her whispers in the silence. The Cecil Hotel, with its grim history and tormented souls, has left an indelible mark on his soul, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of reality. The mist clung to the island like a shroud, its tendrils snaking through the skeletal trees, whispering secrets in a language older than time. The moon, a pale sickle in the inky sky, cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed like phantoms. Thomas gripped his musket tighter, its cold steel a meager comfort against the encroaching darkness. Fear, a bitter taste in his mouth, urged him to turn back, but the desperate cries echoing through the fog spurred him onward. He had been among the last group to arrive at the fledgling colony of Roanoke, eager to escape the suffocating grip of poverty and religious persecution in England. The New World, with its promise of boundless land and untold riches, had beckoned like a siren's call. But the reality was harsh and unforgiving. The soil was poor, the natives wary, and the promised supplies from England were slow to arrive. Then, the disappearances began. At first, it was just livestock, a few chickens gone missing from their coop. A lone pig vanished from its pen. Then, people started to disappear. A young boy, venturing too far into the woods, never returned. A fishing party failed to come back from the sea. Fear, a creeping vine, began to strangle the colony. Governor White, sensing the rising panic, had sailed back to England for supplies and reinforcements, leaving his daughter, Eleanor, and her newborn daughter, Virginia, behind. He had promised to return swiftly, but 3 years had passed, and there was no sign of him. Tonight, it was Martha, the blacksmith's wife, who had vanished. Her husband, crazed with grief, had roused the remaining colonists, their faces etched with terror in the flickering torchlight. They had followed Martha's footprints to the edge of the village, where they abruptly ended, as if she had been swallowed by the earth. Now, a search party, armed with little more than fear and desperation, combed the woods, their voices hoarse from calling her name. Thomas stumbled through the undergrowth, the thorny branches tearing at his clothes. The forest seemed to press in on him, the air thick with unseen eyes and rustling whispers. He thought he saw a flicker of movement in the distance, a fleeting shadow among the trees. He raised his musket, his heart pounding in his chest. "Martha," he called out, his voice trembling. The only reply was the mournful sigh of the wind. He pushed forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The forest grew darker, the trees thicker, their branches intertwined like grasping claws. He felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He was being watched. He rounded a bend in the path and froze. Before him, bathed in the eerie moonlight, stood a circle of standing stones, their surfaces carved with strange symbols and grotesque figures. A fire burned in the center of the circle, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. And around the fire, swaying rhythmically to the beat of an unseen drum, were figures, human figures, But there was something wrong about them. Their skin was painted with intricate patterns, their bodies adorned with feathers and bones. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, gleamed with an unnatural light. They chanted in a low, guttural tongue, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. And in the center of the circle, impaled on a wooden stake, was Martha. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. Thomas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs were rooted to the spot. He watched in horror as the figures began to dance around Martha's body, their movements growing faster and more frenzied. They raised their arms to the sky, their voices reaching a fever pitch. And then, as one, they turned their gaze towards Thomas. He felt a surge of terror, a primal instinct to flee. He turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, heedless of the thorns and branches that tore at his flesh. He could hear the figures behind him, their footsteps pounding the earth, their voices growing louder. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw them, their eyes burning like coals in the darkness, their bodies elongated and distorted in the moonlight. They were gaining on him. He burst out of the forest and onto the beach, the sand cold and wet beneath his feet. He could see the faint outline of the village in the distance, the flickering torches like beacons of hope. He stumbled towards it, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. He reached the edge of the village and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. He looked back at the forest, but the figures were gone. Only the mist remained, swirling and eddying in the darkness. He staggered to his feet and stumbled towards the nearest house. He pounded on the door, his knuckles raw. "Help!" he cried. "They're coming." The door opened a crack, and a terrified face peered out. "Who's there?" a voice whispered. "It's Thomas," he gasped. "I've seen them. The people who took Martha. There." He trailed off, unable to find the words to describe the horrors he had witnessed. The door opened wider, and a woman stepped out, her face pale and drawn. "Come in, Thomas," she said. "You're safe now." He stumbled into the house, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. He collapsed onto a chair, his mind reeling. The woman brought him a cup of water, her hands shaking. "What did you see, Thomas?" she asked. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw them," he whispered. "The Crotone." The woman gasped and clutched at her chest. "The Crotone," she whispered. "But they're just a legend." "No," Thomas said. "They're real, and they're coming for us." The woman's face paled, and she sank to her knees. "God help us," she whispered. Thomas closed his eyes, his mind filled with images of the horrors he had witnessed. He knew that the Crotone were coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. The next morning, the villagers gathered in the center of the village, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. They debated what to do, but there was no easy answer. Some argued that they should flee the island, while others insisted that they should stay and fight. But in the end, they were paralyzed by fear and indecision. As the sun began to set, the mist returned, thicker and more menacing than before. The villagers huddled together in their homes, their hearts pounding in their chests. They listened to the wind howling through the trees, and they prayed for deliverance. But there was no deliverance. In the dead of night, the Crotone attacked. They swarmed through the village, their eyes burning with an unholy light, their voices raised in a terrifying chant. The villagers fought back with whatever weapons they could find, but they were no match for the Crotone's supernatural powers. The village was quickly overrun, its streets stained with blood and littered with corpses. Thomas, hiding in the attic of his house, watched in horror as the Crotone rampaged through the village. He saw them drag his neighbors from their homes, their screams echoing through the night. He saw them tear apart his friends and family, their bodies left to rot in the streets. He knew that his time was running out. He crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The Crotone were everywhere, their eyes searching for any sign of life. He ducked back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to escape. He had to warn the others. He crept down the stairs, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He reached the front door and hesitated. He could hear the Croton outside, their voices close now. He took a deep breath and opened the door. He slipped out into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran through the streets, dodging the Croton, his eyes searching for a way out. He reached the edge of the village and hesitated. There was nowhere to go. He was trapped. He turned to face the Croton, his eyes filled with defiance. He raised his musket and fired. The shot echoed through the night, and a Croton fell to the ground, its body writhing in pain. The other Croton turned towards Thomas, their eyes burning with rage. They advanced on him, their voices raised in a terrifying chant. Thomas knew that he was doomed. He closed his eyes and waited for the end. But the end never came. He opened his eyes and saw that the Croton had vanished. The mist had cleared, and the moon shone brightly in the sky. The village was silent, its streets empty. Thomas was alone. He wandered through the deserted village, his mind reeling. What had happened? Where had the Croton gone? He didn't know, but he knew that he was the only survivor of the Roanoke colony. He left the village and walked into the forest, his footsteps echoing through the trees. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew that he couldn't stay here. He walked for days, his clothes ragged, his body exhausted. He ate berries and roots, and he drank from streams. He slept under the stars, and he dreamed of the horrors he had witnessed. One day, he came to a river. He followed the river downstream, hoping that it would lead him to civilization. After many days, he came to a small village. The villagers were friendly, and they took him in. They gave him food and shelter, and they listened to his story. They told him that the Croton were a legend, a myth told to scare children. They said that the Roanoke colony had simply disappeared, its fate a mystery. Thomas didn't believe them. He knew that the Croton were real. He had seen them with his own eyes. He stayed in the village for a few weeks, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He knew that the Croton were still out there, somewhere, waiting for him. He left the village and continued his journey. He wandered the wilderness for years, searching for a place to call home, but he never found it. He was haunted by the memories of the Roanoke colony, and he knew that he would never escape the horrors he had witnessed. He died alone, in the wilderness, his body never found. But his story lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a warning about the dangers of the New World. And so, the tale ends, leaving a lingering chill even as the rain outside begins to soften. But remember, every shadow holds a story, and every whisper on the wind might be a ghostly echo. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the unknown, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the Rainy Night Storyteller for more tales of mystery and horror. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be undisturbed.